Welcome to the Metal Collector. Today I'm in the mood for some old school death metal. Stay tuned. Welcome once again for the Metal Collector. It's Sunday today and I have been in the mood for some old school death metal. And then I was thinking to do this, my top 10 of old school death metal albums of all time. Before I start, I have, it will not be a top 10 after all, because there are actually, there was two albums I really needed to put on here, and they will both be on the second place. I know it's a little bit, yeah, you can discuss, but I can't really seem to find out which one of those two albums I like the most. They are equally great. And there will be one album I have to name, but it won't be a part of the list. I just have to, just show it because it was a huge part of the whole death metal evolution. So I think we'll just give it a go. My top 10, 11 of the death metal albums. This is the album I just have to show you. Possessed Seven Churches is considered by many to be the first death metal album ever. Now, I'm not completely sure if I agree on that, because I love this album. It's not that, but again, it's you will, if you listen to this album, you could argue whether it's a very extreme sort of thrash album. There is a song on this called Death Metal, I know, but to put this on as the first death metal album ever, I wouldn't know. I still consider this to be, it's a very important album, not to debate, for the death metal evolution. But to call it the first death metal album, I don't know. I call this a great album and a raw thrash metal album. So I just had to name this album because it was important. Now, here comes the top list. The first album is the debut album from 6 Feet Under, Haunted. This is one hell of an album. I love this. It's very groovy. Chris Barnes, he decided to leave Cannibal Corpse and he... Whoa! Oh, I hate when that happened. He decided to leave Cannibal Corpse and do this band instead, and they released this album, the debut album. And it's very groovy. It's raw in many ways. I would consider this to be a little bit, if you can say that in death metal, a little bit more laid back kind of experience. Nevertheless, his lyrics and his vocals put the brutality in 6 Feet Under. And this is the greatest album by the band. They have never managed to do an album that was just as great as this. And again, I listened to this the other day and it's still good. That was on spot number 10. Now, number 9. German Morgoth. The Cursed album. This is, I think it was released in 91. I'm not sure about the release year. Anyway, they never got the recognition, in my opinion, that they deserved, because you can hear the inspiration sources from bands like, of course, Death, but everybody was more or less inspired by Chuck, and first his Mantas, later Death. So that's not a surprise. And also a little bit of Morbid Angel on this album. I think they have some doomy parts as well, where especially over the lead parts, there's a little doomy atmosphere. I catch them live a couple of years ago, and it was really a great experience. So this is definitely also on my top 10 list. The next one, Massacre from Beyond. I know the lineup for this album is almost the same lineup as on a certain Death album. We'll come to that in a little bit. I like this album. It also sounds like old Death. A little bit more variation on this, I would say. And Cam Lee, many people believe that he was maybe not the inventor of the growl, the guttural vocals, but he definitely was one of those that did something to make it a little bit more wide. I don't know. He was a very important figure in the evolution of guttural vocals. Let's just call it that. But that was on spot number 8. Also a good album. Now comes Cannibal Corpse, Eaten Back to Life, the debut album. A very brutal little piece, short songs, brutal vocals, lyrics. Chris Barnes again, of course. I was actually a little bit split between this and The Bleeding, but in the end I chose this. I don't know if it was because of nostalgic reasons and because it was number 1, but The Bleeding is also very good, just almost as good as this. But this album is my favorite Cannibal Corpse with The Bleeding, but it was the one I chose for this list. Moving on to the next spot, which will be spot number 6. I've lost track. Count? No. Suffocation, Effigy of the Forgotten. Those guys are not the inventors, but they were a very, very important part in the technical death metal genre, because when this came out in '91, not many people, not many bands played this sort of stuff. It was very unique for its time. Again, a lot of different kinds of pieces in the songs, and Mike Smith, his drum skills were absolutely amazing, full of details, and the speed of the album. Frank Mullen's vocals, very deep. My favorite album with Suffocation, I know Pierced From Within are perhaps many old school fans best, their favorite album. This is also on many lists, but this is my Effigy of the Forgotten, my favorite Suffocation, and on the top spot of old school death metal classics as well. Now we are moving on to Holland with Pestilence, Consuming Impulse. Not a very it's not an album that takes a lot of prisoners to say, but I really love this. It's very charming in its primitive ways. Yeah, they have. It was from '89, and they had some fun things on the album. The first album they did was thrash metal, and then they moved along to a more brutal style, and this came out. And I know a lot of people were very thrilled for this album. Again, '89, not so much full lengths was released, not so many full lengths was released in this period within the death metal community. Death metal was just about to explode at this point from 1991, and I don't know. I just love this album. It's great. I still put it on from time to time, and I like it. I love it. We stay in Holland for a little bit because the next one, this will be, again, I have lost track of where we are, but Thanatos with Realm of Ecstasy. That was it. This is perhaps not the most known album myself. I found it in a second-hand store, I think it was. Or was it on one of those, cheap shelves in a record store where it was 25 Danish crowns or something, and it just looked like something you had to own. So I bought it, and I was completely overwhelmed by how great this album actually was. This is also the second album. Unfortunately, I haven't listened to the new stuff they did after they did a reunion kind of stuff. I don't even know if they are still around. I think they are, but I have to follow up on that. But this album is a hidden gem within the death metal, the early death metal, old school death metal stuff, I would say. And a song like Mankind's Afterbirth, that was it, is one of the greatest brutal old school death metal songs ever written. But this, if you're into, they have a little bit of the groove that Deicide also has in their music. Not to compare those two bands more, but and like with Pestilence, the vocals are not so deep. They are more harsh, if that's the word. A little bit more screaming, if you can say that. And it's the same thing with Stefan Gebedi, I think his name. Stefan Gebedi, vocals and guitars. That was his name. His vocals are also in the more harsh end. But definitely an album to check out. If you don't know Thanatos, give this album a spin. I will promise you, you will enjoy it if you're into old school death metal stuff. Here comes, this is entry number 3 because it was a shared second place. Death with Leprosy. In my opinion, the best death album. I know this is the most primitive album. I think it's even more primitive than Scream Bloody Gore. Again, almost the lineup from Massacres from Beyond. I think there was a story that Terry Butler, even though he is on the cover, he didn't play it. I think it was Chuck himself who played the bass for this album. What I love about this album is the riffs. It's very primitive. Also, Primitive Ways is perhaps my favorite tune with the band. But it's very primitive compared to what they began to do after this. Spiritual Healing evolved the band, and Human just exploded into something brutal, and the lineup for that album is insane. I know a lot of the old school death metal fans are very happy for the Human album. It's also a very great album. I also love it, but compared to the last album he did, Chuck, with Death, where the technical abilities was pretty high, especially for its time. This is so primitive, but I really enjoy this album. I love this album. It's still my number 1 death, and I put this on very often, and yeah. So here comes the second place, which I had to split between these two albums. I can show them at the same time. Also classic ones. Altars of Madness with Morbid Angel and Slowly with Rot with Obituary. Those two albums are equally great. Morbid Angel, the debut album, of course, a classic. Immortal Rights, one of the greatest songs ever written. The whole album in itself, it's very brutal, and for its time, the extremeness of the album was unheard of when it was released. And he had Pete Sandoval coming in to do the drums because he needed a drummer that could play as fast as he wanted to play, especially with the double bass drum. And again, timeless, really, really terrific, really great album. I don't have words for it, but Obituary, Slowly We Rot, more slow and groovy kind of stuff. And you also know this one. It's one of the classics within the old school death metal. And these two albums, it's a must-have. When you're into old school death metal, you know this album and you have these albums. Not so much to say, this is just amazing. Now comes spot number 1, my all-time favorite death metal, old school death metal album, but also my favorite death metal album in general, and my favorite death metal band, Deicide, Once Upon the Cross. I know a lot of people would say that the debut is the best work from Deicide or Legion, but in my eyes and ears, it will always be Once Upon the Cross. The brutality combined with the special Deicide groove, they have something. Steve Asheim is one hell of a drummer, and I know he also writes a lot of the material, but there is something about this unique groovy kind of thing they do. Not to compare it to groovy metal, because it's not groovy metal, but they have their own unique sound and way to play. And with Glenn's vocals on top of it all, and you have the Hoffman brothers, very, very great playing on this as well, and the production, Scott Burns' production, is amazing on this. This just enters the #1 spot for old school death metal for me. Now, this was my top list. It became a top 11 list in some ways, and I also mentioned Possessed Seven Churches, which also was very important for this. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know what you think are the greatest death metal, old school death metal albums of all time. And with these words, have a nice Sunday, and see you on the next video. Goodbye.